Hello, everyone, and welcome to our April edition of Voices for the West, a webinar series brought to you by Advocates for the West. My name is Will Shoemaker, and I am Communications and Engagement Director at Advocates for the West. The title of today's program is A Dam Problem, Fighting to Save Salmon in Oregon's Willamette River Basin. We're excited to be joined by Jennifer Fairbrother, Kathleen George, and Laurie Rule. Before we kick things off, I'd like to better get to know all of you who are in attendance and offer you an ability to do the same. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see the chat section. And please take a moment and drop into the chat what you are most excited about with the coming warmer weather. We've all been dealing with a lot in recent weeks and months, so hopefully this puts us in a positive state in mind going into today's talks. I am writing into the chat now myself. Camping and rivers. You will remain on mute throughout the course of today's talks. However, we do welcome your questions. And if a question comes to mind at any point during the course of the webinar, please do feel free to take a moment and drop it into the Q&A section. I will note that's located also at the bottom of your screen, but is different from the chat. And we'll get to as many of those questions as time allows toward the end of today's webinar. Let's see, folks are excited about whitewater, exploring, hiking, and camping, return of migratory birds. Thanks so much for taking a minute and sharing what's exciting you going into the summer season. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first presenter, Jennifer Fairbrother. Jennifer joined Native Fish Society in 2018 in the role of Campaign and Columbia Regional Director before becoming the organization's Conservation Director in 2020 and then Legislative and Policy Director in 2024. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Will, and welcome everybody today for being here. As Will mentioned, I'm Jennifer Fairbrother. I'm with Native Fish Society. We are an organization based in the Pacific Northwest, focused on the recovery of abundant, self-sustaining wild fish, free-flowing rivers, and thriving local communities. And I'm really excited to get to share with you all today about the Willamette, which is a place very near and dear to my heart, as I've called it home for most of my life. And Will, do you want to get the slides up? All right. So today I'm going to start by essentially grounding us in this place and in these fish before I hand it over to Kathleen and Laurie to talk a little bit more about what's happening now, both on the litigation and legislative front. So next slide. So when we talk about fish, especially anadromous fish, and by that I mean fish that spend part of their life cycle in the ocean and part of their life cycle in freshwater environments, we have to talk about the landscapes that they come from, because they evolved over many millions of years to be uniquely adapted to the specific watersheds that they call home and that are their natal waters. So today we're talking about the Willamette, and the Willamette River Basin is the largest river basin that's wholly contained within the borders of the state of Oregon. So it's a pretty large area. When it comes to humans, about 70% of Oregon's population lives here. So it's also a place where these rivers have a lot of human interaction. The basin runs from the headwaters that are in the south to the north, where it meets the confluence with the Columbia at Portland. And I often think of it as kind of divided into east side and west side. So west of the main stem, we have fewer rivers. They tend to be shorter. They arise out of the Coast Range Mountains. They're, as I mentioned, lower gradient, as well as they tend to have lower flows, especially in the summer months. And then we have these big tributaries on the east side that originate out of the Cascade Mountains. So they're higher gradient rivers, especially in their headwaters, and they have a more continuous flow due to snowmelt and the springs that come from that. So historically, our fish species have tended to, return to these east side tributaries as their main home waters. That's not to say there aren't fish even today that make their home on the west side, but these are really the fish producing powerhouse tributaries to this basin. Next slide. So today we're going to be talking in particular about two of the species that reside in this valley. So this is spring Chinook salmon and winter steelhead. So these are the only two historically native anadromous species. So again, fish that go to the ocean and back. And they, in particular, are uniquely adapted to the Willamette for several reasons. So spring Chinook salmon and winter steelhead both lay their eggs in headwater habitats and arise from the gravel and spend part of their life cycle as juvenile fish in the freshwater ecosystem, growing bigger and stronger. And then they reach a point where they undergo a process called smoltification, and they're still pretty small at this point, but that triggers them to make this migration from their natal waters out through the Willamette main stem and Columbia and into the ocean, where they'll spend several years feeding and growing really large. So historically, spring Chinook salmon often ranged up to, around 100 pounds or even more. Today, the fish come back more in the like 10 to 20, though every now and then a big fish comes in. The difference between salmon and steelhead is that steelhead can reproduce and make the journey multiple times, whereas salmon die after they spawn the first time. So that makes winter steelhead a really phenomenal species, that they can make that journey out to the ocean and back multiple times. Next slide. In particular, in the Willamette, these fish adopted over many millennia to this landscape, which includes Willamette Falls. And Willamette Falls is the second largest waterfall by volume in North America. And I will caveat that by saying Celilo Falls used to be bigger, but has since been inundated by the dam. So this is actually a really big physical feature in the watershed that these fish have adapted a unique run timing for. So they actually return earlier than many of their counterparts in the rest of the Columbia Basin in order to get to Willamette Falls at the right time, where the flows are high enough for them to get over the falls and into the upper part of the basin before the flows go down and create a complete barrier to passage. And I will mention that spring Chinook in particular have an interesting, what we call life history, in that they come back, as their name suggests, in the spring. And they actually have to spend the entire summer over summering in the basin before they spawn in the fall. So that means they need access to these cool, consistent headwater habitats that can sustain them over the summer before they spawn. Next slide. So things have changed in the last 200 years since settlement in this area. It's historically believed that on the low end of estimates, about 500,000 spring Chinook and winter steelhead return to this basin. Some estimates have that in the low millions. But for a number of reasons I'll get into in a minute, these populations have declined precipitously since their historic highs. As you can see, in the 80s, we were down to less than 1% of these populations. And in 2017, we unfortunately had the lowest run year on record for steelhead, with only 512 steelhead making it into the upper basin, which, to remind you, is the largest watershed wholly contained within our state. Next slide. And there are a lot of reasons for this decline over the last couple of centuries. We have had a huge impact on our river ecosystems. We have channelized them and drained wetlands. We have dammed them. We have logged them. We have turned them into our main agricultural center. So we have changed the function of these ecosystems significantly. We also, unfortunately, polluted our waterways significantly for quite some time. And we also had extensive harvest of our fisheries, especially in the Columbia system. The canneries were harvesting millions and millions of pounds of salmon every year. But you look at these things and you say, well, certainly, we have more we can still do today, but we have done a lot. We no longer have the canneries. We have significantly cleaned up our water and our rivers. We have done a lot to restore functionality and habitat. So why are we still seeing these declines persist? Next slide. So in the 50s and 60s, the federal government built a series of 13 dams in the Willamette. And these dams were primarily built for flood control so that we could, have our cities and our farms and our industry lower down in the valley and not risk catastrophic flooding year after year. But the result has been that they have impacted our salmon runs and steelhead runs significantly. Next slide. And in particular, we think of three big buckets in which they've had these impacts. The first is lack of passage, and I want to mention that we need to think of passage in this context as two components, not just upstream, getting adult fish above the dams, but also in getting juvenile fish down from above to below the dams in their outmigration. We've also drastically changed flows below the dams, as well as created these big kind of stagnant reservoirs above. And we've had changes in our water quality, both below and in these reservoirs above the dams. And all of these things together have had a big impact on these species. Next slide. So despite all the good things we have done to try and ameliorate these issues, in 1999, because of the continued decline, these fish were listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. And at the time, the Federal Fisheries Agency said, a big driver of this is how we are operating these dams, and that if we don't have changes at these dams, then we will continue to see these fish move towards decline and we will risk extinction. Next slide. So I'm going to focus in now specifically on passage, because this is really the key to unlocking this system, and in particular downstream passage. So this is the passage for juvenile fish. Fortunately, we've figured out passage well enough for adult fish. I should mention these dams were built without fish ladders. And because of how tall they are and the surrounding topography, even today, it's not feasible to install fish ladders, which would be the ultimate ideal because it would allow fish to move up and down under their own timing and under their own volition. But since that's not an option, we've kind of solved for the adult portion, but we still need to get a handle on the juvenile portion. And really, the issue is that there's only a few ways that fish can move upstream of the dam to downstream. So these dams, most of them have different configurations of what we call spillway gates, penstock intakes, so those are the power routes, and RO gates, or regulating outlets. So in an ideal world where you could have the reservoir full all the time, you'd be able to do spill most of the time, and that's actually a pretty effective route for fish to get past dams. Unfortunately, because these dams are primarily for flood control, we don't want them full all the time. We need to have room in these reservoirs, especially during the flood season, for if we're going to have a flood event, to capture that water behind the dam. And you can't do that if your reservoir is already full. So most of the time, we don't have access to pass fish through the spillway. What ends up happening is the majority of the time, the water route that fish can access is through the powerhouse. And this tends to have high impacts on mortality. And that's assuming the fish even find their way to the intake, because these are species that tend to travel as juveniles in the very top of the water column in the first 15 to 20 feet. The RO, regulating outlet gates, historically haven't been used, especially not for fish passage. They're very deep in the dam, so even if they are being utilized to pass water, as I mentioned, it's hard for fish to find them and pass through them. So historically, we've had this issue of, because the Corps doesn't want to fill the reservoirs all the way because they need to maintain flood control, and they don't want to lower the reservoirs to get to those regulating outlets because they want to maintain hydropower production, we have not had an effective way to get fish through these dams. There are two options at present. So next slide. We can do what's called a deep drawdown, which is the way that we can provide volitional passage, but this comes at the cost of hydropower production. So you lower the reservoir level down to those regulating outlets towards the bottom and allow the fish to follow the flow through those outlets. But you sacrifice your ability during that period of time to produce hydropower. Next slide. So if you want to keep hydropower operational on this system, which has been the Corps' focus, then you have to utilize what we call floating fish collectors or fish collection facilities. And these are really big contraptions that you can think of as a vacuum, essentially. You hope that the fish kind of get close enough that they feel the flow going into these things and they follow them. But they have a number of problems. They take a really long time to design and build. They're extremely expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars each, and we're talking about multiple dams that need fish passage. And unfortunately, where they have been installed in reservoirs with similar attributes to the Willamette, they have not been effective. So we're concerned that the Corps, by pursuing a non-volitional fish collection plan, is going to not be effective once they get it running, but that we might run out of time for these fish to start making the turn towards recovery before they get to the point of no return. So next slide. Oh, and I did want to point out just really briefly that the amount of power coming off the Willamette is really minuscule in the scheme of what is happening in the Pacific Northwest. And so we continue to advocate for, next slide, for doing what we can operationally through drawdown. So this is a drawdown a couple years ago at Cougar Dam, where again, we took the level of the reservoir down, returned that river so that the fish could find their way through that, what was a reservoir to the dam and find their way through the dam. Next slide. And here's one more picture of another drawdown that year as well. So I'm going to turn it over now to Kathleen and Laurie, and they're going to give you a lot more context about how we have been advocating both through our legal efforts and our legislative efforts to help restore these fish.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Next, I would like to introduce Kathleen George. Kathleen is a council member for the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. She has spent her career helping tribal people and governments accomplish their goals and build their future. Prior to being elected to the Tribal Council, Kathleen was director of Spirit Mountain Community Fund, the philanthropic arm of the tribe. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thanks very much, Will. It's great to be here.
And we're going to take a slightly different approach for this portion of the webinar, in that I get the honor of having a conversation with you, Kathleen, about your perspective on some of these issues that Jennifer raised. So first off, in recognition of the longtime stewards of these resources, can you explain why native salmon are important to tribal people in Oregon?
I'd be happy to do that, Will. So the tribes that make up the modern Confederation of Grand Ronde have lived with salmon, and in particular Willamette salmon, since time immemorial. There is no part of the history of our people who lived throughout the Willamette Basin that does not occur in harmony and in reliance upon our salmon relatives. And so that is a very deep relationship, and it's one that's carried through from our ancestors to us today. And it's an essential part of tribal culture and identity. The Treaty of 1855 ceded the Willamette Valley to the United States government, but that never terminated our relationship with those salmon and our reliance upon them. And so it is an issue that's very near and dear to the heart of Grand Ronde people, and it's an essential component of tribal culture. It's also, in my opinion, an essential part of Oregon and what it means to be an Oregonian. You know, these fish are iconic to our region and to our state, and all Oregonians rely on healthy waterways, and our salmon and steelhead are critical indicators of the health of our river systems. And so when our salmon and steelhead are in trouble, our rivers are in trouble and our communities are in trouble. It's hard for me to imagine a Willamette River that doesn't have salmon and steelhead in it. And I hope that that day never comes. So our scientists work closely with scientists from the state of Oregon and NOAA Fisheries. And all of the best scientists are telling us the same thing. And that's the time is running out to save these species from extinction. So that's why, while the Grand Ronde tribe has been involved, at the technical level for a very long time, seeing the lack of progress on this issue, our tribal government has decided that we really have to get more involved at the local and the national level to work with leaders to make sure that things that need to happen to save these species from extinction happen before time runs out.
So I want to dig a little bit deeper into kind of that aspect of things. So, we know that one of the main drivers of the species, sharp decline is Army Corps of Engineers management of the dams. And I'm going to pull up a slide here in a second to help illustrate what we're discussing. But can you tell us a little more about, what the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde are doing to raise awareness about this problem?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And thanks for sharing that image. And I also want to thank Jennifer for giving us a really fantastic introduction to the technical side of the management issues at this Willamette System dams, because the headline here really is that the way that the Willamette River dams are currently being managed are pushing these iconic fish towards extinction. Simply put, the way we're managing these dams today, the way the Army Corps of Engineers is managing these dams today, kills salmon and loses money. A lot of salmon and a lot of money. These dams produce far less than 2% of our regional power, but in doing so, they block critical habitat and they waste taxpayer and ratepayer dollars. So that's where this tension comes in, right? Jennifer has laid out for us that there are solutions to passing juvenile fish through these dams if we are willing to use those solutions. But that requires changing the management of the reservoirs to do that seasonal drawdown to let those young fish out of the system. And our biologists have known this. NOAA Fisheries has called for seasonal drawdowns for juvenile passage for many, many years. But the Corps has repeatedly ignored those directives and those requirements to comply with the Endangered Species Act. And sadly, they've also ignored congressional directives to consider a better path forward. So what is essential are those seasonal drawdowns. And again, what we see here is one image of these high head dams and what it looks like. And in this case, the image is from the Fall Creek drawdown. When we allow the reservoirs behind these dams to act like and look like, function like the rivers that really are still there beneath these reservoirs. So when we have that seasonal drawdown that Jennifer described for us, that allows those young fish to find those open pathways through the dams without having to go through the turbines. And we can do that. We can restore salmon, and we can do this in a way that does not, require dam removal like needs to happen in other parts of the region. This can be a seasonal variation in the management of the dams. So it's very possible. And where it's been tried, as in Fall Creek, it's been tremendously successful. So Grand Ronde has been working to really try to promote the continued use of seasonal drawdown. to make it happen in many more dams throughout this system where it's needed to prevent extinction. And so we've been reaching out. We've been meeting with Oregon's congressional delegation in Washington, D.C. We've been having conversations with local communities to better understand their needs and how we can move forward with drawdown more broadly. And working with the state of Oregon, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the governor's office to really try to unify voices for seasonal drawdown while these kinds of approaches can still be successful.
All right, I'm going to pull down the slide for just a second here. You had mentioned that the Army Corps has not met some deadlines set by Congress. I think, just to help us better understand, why is it important that, the Army Corps meet these deadlines that Congress has set in this instance?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And to do that, I kind of want to start by revisiting some of the urgency, right? Because that's a critical component of this. We need to be doing the right things. The Army Corps of Engineers need to be allowing for that drawdown, and it needs to be done sooner rather than later. This is not a situation where we can wait another 10, 15, 20 years to be doing the right thing, because our salmon and steelhead simply don't have the time. These dams block access to 75% of the basin's critical salmon and steelhead spawning habitat. And although we are getting the fish up there and they are reproducing, if those fish do not have, those young fish don't have safe passage out of the system, well, then we remain on the path to extinction. That we have to remember too that, that 2024 study from NOAA Fisheries found that because of the salmon's lack of passage around the Willamette Basin dams, they continue to face that heightened risk of extinction. And NOAA Fisheries has said that that's really likely by about 2040. So we simply do not have time to wait decades for new projects, new floating fish collectors that are unlikely to be effective, and that the Army Corps of Engineers has no funding to support. So in that context, I want to talk about why it is so important for the Corps to meet the deadlines set by Congress to make progress on this. So the Corps must follow the law. And in this case, that means evaluating how we move forward with removing hydropower at these dams. So not only is that going to allow that volitional passage for young fish by the seasonal drawdowns, but it will save Oregonians money on their power bills at the same time, because this very small percentage of power that's produced at these dams is the most expensive hydropower in the system. Even the Bonneville Power Administration has discussed this and wants to stop having to market power produced at these dams because it is so tremendously inefficient to produce hydropower at these dams. So Congress passed again in 2024 a bipartisan law, Water Resources Development Act, or WRDA 2024, which requires the Corps to evaluate an alternative in the Willamette system dams to remove this extremely expensive hydropower that's imperiling salmon. And this is not the first time that Congress has told the Army Corps of Engineers to study the effects of deauthorizing hydropower in the Willamette Valley. Because in the Willamette, hydropower production has always been used as the excuse for not prioritizing the drawdown necessary for salmon and steelhead migration that has been deemed essential for recovery and survival of these species. So as long as hydropower remains the excuse, that seems to be preventing the needed drawdowns throughout the system. But although this has been directed before to the Army Corps of Engineers by Congress in WRDA 2020 and WRDA 2022, the Corps has missed those deadlines to submit those reports to Congress. And so in WRDA 2024, it marks the third time Congress has said, you need to do this work, you need to plan for deauthorization, and you need to report back to us on this issue. So This is why we have been working with other advocates to spend time in Washington, D.C., to work with our congressional representatives to say we need to stop accepting the Army Corps of Engineers not responding to these congressional deadlines. The region, the state, needs the information requested in these directives to plan for a future where hydropower isn't prioritized over salmon and steelhead in this basin. So we've been working with salmon advocates, we've been working with the state of Oregon's to educate our congressionals and to, try to provide this kind of unified voice that we don't have time to wait for untested technologies and unfunded technologies like these huge floating fish collectors that the Army Corps of Engineers continues to want to rely upon. And it truly is something that we need to just put on the table and take a hard look at. Not only has this type of technology, these floating fish collectors, not been very successful in other places where they've been tried, but they would cost hundreds of millions of dollars that nobody has to build these structures that would take a tremendous amount of time to put into place, when we have solutions right now that we just need to consistently implement.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. I have one more question for you, and that is, what actions can viewers take to make a difference on this issue?
I think the best thing that we can ask folks to continue to do is to speak to your congressional representatives and the governor to continue to make sure that this is a priority. It really is Oregon's salmon and steelhead that are on the line. But when we have, ESA compliance and NEPA documents, environmental impact statements, and, WRDA bills coming and going, all the law and the compliance and the multiple technical documents, one following after the other, the imperative that we must focus on this to get the implementation we need sooner rather than later. I think it gets lost in this bureaucratic list of acronyms and documents coming one after the other. And it becomes very easy for these compliance deadlines to be drawn out. And if the Army Corps of Engineers is continued to allow to not turn in the required reports to Congress, time is ticking that our salmon and steelhead just don't have. So my ask would be, tell our senators, tell our representatives that this is important to you, that Oregon, Willamette, salmon and steelhead don't have time. We have to prioritize drawdowns. We have to deauthorize hydropower, and tell them that it's important, that you don't believe in a Willamette future without salmon and steelhead in it. If we could get some calls or some emails to our senators, to our representatives, to the governor, reminding them that this is essential and we don't have time to lose, I think that's what's needed. We have to refuse to accept the path that we're on, which has been a path of delay. And if this is a priority to you, we ask you to join us in insisting that we reflect that priority now in the Willamette.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for giving us an overview on all of the efforts of the Grand Ronde. Our next speaker is Advocates for the West Senior Attorney Laurie Rule, and I'm going to pull up Laurie's slides. If you'll bear with me for just a second. Laurie has been with Advocates for the West since our inception in 2003. She has been the lead attorney on our efforts to protect salmon and other native fish in Oregon's Willamette River Basin. And Laurie heads our Portland, Oregon office. Welcome, Laurie.
Thanks, Will. So yes, since I'm a lawyer, I'm going to talk about litigation because that's what we do. I've been working on an ongoing case for a number of years against the Army Corps of Engineers over many of the dams that Jennifer and Kathleen have talked about. And that I'm going to talk a little bit about that case. And then we also recently filed a new case that I'm going to talk about a little bit as well that involves Chinook salmon and bull trout, which is also a native species in parts of the upper Willamette Basin. So next slide, please, Will. So first, I'm going to just talk about two key provisions of the Endangered Species Act. As we've noted, upper Willamette Chinook salmon and steelhead and bull trout are all listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And the Act has a couple of key provisions. One is that all federal agencies must ensure that their actions do not jeopardize a threatened species. And jeopardize means taking an action that is reasonably expected to reduce the likelihood of a listed species' survival and recovery in the wild by appreciably diminishing its numbers, reproduction, or distribution. So in other words, a federal agency can't do something that is going to impair a species from not only surviving, but from recovering to a point where it could be removed from the endangered species list. So these are actions that impair the species as a whole, essentially. So the jeopardy provision really pertains to, you know, a wide look at the species as a whole. Another provision under the Endangered Species Act is the take provision, which prohibits any person, not just federal agencies, but any person, from an action that harasses, harms, wounds, kills, traps, captures, and a number of other actions that reflect harm to threatened or endangered species. So again, no person, what company, private individual, federal agency, whatever, can take an action that is going to take a listed species. And so those were two of the key provisions that were the focus of our litigation against the Army Corps of Engineers. As Jennifer and Kathleen talked about, you know, these dams that the Army Corps of Engineers manages in the upper Willamette Basin harm salmon and steelhead in a number of ways. They cut off important spawning and rearing habitat. They degrade downstream water quality. They alter water flows downstream. And so there's a number of ways that they impair these species. Next slide, Will. In 2018, we filed our first lawsuit against the Army Corps, and that was basically reflected the Army Corps of Engineers' failure to implement a number of actions that the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS, required the Corps to take. In 2008, NMFS came out with a kind of a long-term plan called the biological opinion that the Corps was supposed to implement in order to improve things for these fish. And they included a number of actions that would try to improve fish passage, especially downstream fish passage for juveniles, that would improve water quality, especially water temperatures and total dissolved gas below the dams, and that would improve water flows through the dams. And these were all changes that could be implemented through operational changes or sometimes structural changes at the dams. But the Army Corps of Engineers was not implementing these things. NMFS had included a number of deadlines for actions. The Corps blew past a bunch of those deadlines. And so when we got to 2018 and the Corps had failed to do many of the actions that NMFS was requiring, we filed our lawsuit. Next slide. And I'm going to sort of fast forward a number of years, we got a really good decision from the U.S. District Court in Oregon on all of our legal claims. We brought a jeopardy claim, a take claim, and also a reinitiation claim, which argued that the Corps and NMFS had to reinitiate ESA consultation and come up with a new biological opinion because the Corps was not following the 2008 biological opinion. And we won all three of our claims. The judge found that the Corps had failed to take actions to improve downstream passage and water quality, which was contributing to the continued decline of the species. He found that the Corps was causing take of the species, primarily through high mortality of fish during downstream passage. That's the juvenile fish. And then he also found that because the Corps and NMFS had delayed reinitiating consultation for so long, even after the Corps had violated the prior biological opinion, that the delay in restarting consultation created additional harm to the species. So we got a great legal ruling in August of 2020. Next slide, Will, and it had a really great quote that I'll let you read for yourselves, but this is one of the strongest, I think, quotes from a court that I've had in one of my cases that I've brought, and it really reflected, the judge's understanding of the situation and the peril that these fish are in. And so the next step in the case was, okay, we got a great ruling on the merits. What does that mean? Well, then we had to litigate the whole second round of the case, which was, what are we going to get from this? What is the remedy for these legal violations? And we asked for a number of things. Frankly, a lot of what we asked for in our remedy request was the same things that NIMS and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife had been asking the Corps to do for years. It was, implementing more of these deep drawdowns that both Jennifer and Kathleen talked about, as well as trying to implement more spill in the spring where the fish can go through the spillway, because that's probably actually the safest route. And it required changes to operations that would improve water quality, in particular water temperatures and total dissolved gas below the dams, as well as improving water flows so that there weren't flows that were too high or flows that were too low that would disturb spawning areas below the dams. Next slide, Will. So about a year after we got that great merits ruling, we also got a really great remedy ruling from the court in September of 2021. The judge granted about 90% of what we asked for in our remedy request. And one of the most important parts of the remedy ruling by Judge Hernandez was his order that, yes, the Corps does have authority to reduce power production for the benefit of the fish. So the Army Corps of Engineers had been arguing, well, we can't do these deep drawdowns because it means that we're going to be able to produce less power. And one of the purposes of these dams, as Congress determined in the authorization of these dams, is hydropower production. So if the purpose of the dam is hydropower production, we can't do anything that's going to reduce the amount of hydropower production. And the court said, no, that's wrong. It said, yes, if the purpose of the dam is one of the purposes is hydropower, you can't completely eliminate that purpose. You can't completely eliminate hydropower production, but that does not mean you can't reduce it to benefit the fish. These are ESA listed species. ESA species get priority over all other considerations, and you can reduce the level of power produced at these dams if it's needed to benefit the fish. So that was a very important ruling which condoned the use of these deep drawdowns to help the fish in the fall. And so he indeed ordered deep drawdowns at a number of the dams, not just Fall Creek, which Kathleen showed you the picture of. The Corps had actually been doing deep drawdowns at Fall Creek for several years, but he added deep drawdowns at Green Peter Dam, and at Lookout Point Dam, and at Cougar Dam. And so that was exciting to see that. Those are fall drawdowns. He also ordered more spill in the spring, use of different outlets for water temperature control, total dissolved gas control, water flows, etc. And one of the most interesting things, frankly, about our case was the court ordered a panel of experts to be created to come up with implementation plans to implement these different injunction measures. I mean, he's a judge. He doesn't know how to, manage dams. He doesn't want to control how to manage dams. So he appointed an expert panel made up of plaintiffs, two experts from National Marine Fisheries Service, and 2 experts from the Corps to come up with implementation plans to implement these various injunction measures, and which they did. And he ordered the National Marine Fisheries Service to issue a new biological opinion by December of 2024. Next slide, Will. So that is in fact what has happened. The Corps has implemented these measures from September 2021 through December 2024, and indeed NIMS issued its new biological opinion in December 2024. It found that the Corps' proposed continuing operations were still going to jeopardize the fish. So NIMS included some additional measures in the 2024 biological opinion that accelerated some of the Corps' actions compared to what, the timeline that the Corps had proposed, and added some additional measures, including some additional monitoring of the different operations in its December 2024 biological opinion. So that is now in place. Next slide, Will. And so what is the Corps doing? Well, the Corps has not officially said exactly whether it will comply with everything in the new 2024 biological opinion. It issued a final environmental impact statement earlier this month, earlier in April. But that environmental impact statement does not include the no power alternative that Kathleen was talking about that Congress has ordered. So the Corps is going to do a supplemental EIS that considers this no power alternative, plans to do it basically over the course of the next year, and then has said in early 2026, it will then make its final decision about what it plans to do over the next couple of decades as to its operation of these dams. So we will be watching what the Corps decides to do and what its final decision is after it does the supplemental EIS. And then if we don't like it, and if they're not agreeing to do with pretty much everything NIMS told them they have to do in the 2024 biological opinion, we may have another lawsuit on our hands. So that's the case against the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm going to talk real quick about our new case. Next slide, Will. This case is against Eugene Water and Electric Board, and it's over the Mackenzie River, which is one of the tributaries to the Upper Willamette. There is an Army Corps of Engineers dam on the Mackenzie, that's the Cougar Dam, but above Cougar Dam is a series of 3 dams operated by EWEB, Eugene Water and Electric Board, that they get power from those dams, and they're in the upper part of the Mackenzie watershed, and so they impact Chinook salmon and bull trout. And the lower of the 3 dams in this complex is called Trailbridge Dam. And like the other dams in the Upper Willamette, Trailbridge cuts off really high quality spawning habitat for Chinook salmon. It's spawning habitat that has very cold water, clean spawning gravels. It's excellent habitat that those fish cannot access. And that habitat, I might say, is going to get even more important under the impacts of climate change, which are going to make the downriver habitats warmer and less hospitable for spawning. So these upriver habitats are only going to increase in importance. Also above Trailbridge Dam is a local population of bull trout. And actually, we'll give the next slide because that has a little map. So you can see in the red circle, that's where Trailbridge Dam is. And it cuts off this great spawning habitat for Chinook, but it also isolates a population of bull trout, which is also listed as threatened under the ESA. And bull trout, there's a population above Trailbridge, and then there are populations below Trailbridge. And normally, they would migrate back and forth, and the populations below Trailbridge would be able to get upriver to use the good spawning habitat. The population above Trailbridge would be able to go downriver to use to find more prey and to overwinter in larger habitat. That is more hospitable for that. And it also would allow these local populations of bull trout to connect and to interbreed. And so there would be genetic exchange, which would increase genetic diversity within both of the populations and increase their viability and long-term chance for success. And so this dam impairs both of these species. And but just last month or in early March, filed a lawsuit against EWEB for take of both Chinook salmon and bull trout. As I noted, the take provision applies to all persons. And so it includes, a municipal entity like EWEB. And we're just embarking on that case. I can't really talk about it because it's privileged information, but we are going to fight EWEB and try to get improvements and try to get, the key is getting fish passage at Trailbridge Dam so that we can get Chinook and bull trout going upstream and downstream at that dam. And so that's another goal to continue to improve the situation for our native fish in the Upper Willamette Basin.
All right. Thank you, Laurie. and Jennifer and Kathleen for your talks. We do have time, about 10 minutes for questions. We have a number of questions, so we will get to as many of those as time allows here, and I am happy to kind of guide us through that process. So for the first question, how did the drawdown at Cougar affect downstream water quality in the Mackenzie River? Drinking water supply for Eugene? Who would like to answer that question? Oh,
I can
go ahead.
take a stab at it. So one of the things that does make Cougar different than Lookout Point and Foster/Green Peter Reservoir is that it is much higher in the system. So as far as I'm aware, there was not an impact that was ever brought to light on drinking water further downstream. There's also some other things that have helped that as well. There's a big, what we call a stage 0 restoration that has occurred right below Cougar. And that type of restoration of the floodplain habitat is really great for capturing sediments and things like that. So yes, I think, getting to the core of this, we're talking about these reservoirs have been stagnant for decades, 50, 60 years in some cases. And during that time, a lot of sediment has collected behind them. Naturally, in these river ecosystems, sediment would be moving downstream along with woody debris consistently and constantly. But instead, it gets trapped behind these dams. And so when you do a drawdown, especially in those initial years, when you're returning to that original river, you have to cut through a lot of that backlog of sediment and flush it out of the system and into the downstream reaches. And so that can certainly have an impact, as we've seen with some of the initial drawdowns on the Santiam and Middle Fork Willamette. And when you have communities directly below those dams, they can certainly be impacted. At the same time, we think that there are opportunities for the Corps and our federal government to work with these communities to make sure that they have the technologies that they need in order for these drawdowns to occur without being problematic for them to meet their water quality standards or to provide the quantity of water they need to provide. And so that's, I guess, another place where we really need to connect people in this advocacy, is urging our federal government to help these communities so that we can continue doing these drawdowns, because we can do both. We can have clean and plentiful drinking water, and we can help these fish. And I guess one last thing I'll say specific to Cougar is that reservoir was also drawn down about a decade previous for some other management that they were doing around building a temperature control tower. So it's already done a flush about a decade ago. And then one other thing, at Fall Creek, Kathleen had mentioned, we've been seeing drawdowns at Fall Creek for over a decade now. And certainly they have been documenting the sediment changes downstream. And while there was certainly higher sedimentation in the first few drawdowns, over time, we have seen those decrease. And that's also what we expect as we get these rivers reconnected and their natural processes happening year after year.
Anyone else interested in weighing in on that question? If not, I'll move to the next. So how will the proposed change, removing harm from the definition of take, affect the litigation? And there is a clarification that was provided, I believe, in reference to that question, removing habitat modification from definition of harm.
Yeah, this is a hot topic of debate right now in legal circles. My position is that the statute itself allows for that, or requires, frankly, that definition of harm. And so, I mean, removing the regulation would sort of remove the services, condoning of that definition. But I mean, the Supreme Court has said that that definition is consistent with the very language in the statute. The statute itself clearly talks about habitat and recognizes the importance of habitat for protecting species. I mean, it requires, designating critical habitat. It talks about protecting ecosystems. It recognizes the need, that species need their habitat. And so, in my opinion, the statute itself requires that definition of harm to include habitat modification that actually injures species. And so I plan to say, look, regardless of what the regulation says, the statute condones that very same definition, and you have to protect habitat. Any serious degradation of habitat is going to be harmed just based on the language in the statute itself.
In sensitivity to time that we have this midday, early afternoon, I'm going to attempt to combine a couple different questions here. Are we working with congressional staff to modify project purposes to eliminate hydro and modify rule curves and find a solution? And what effect is the current administration likely to have on the campaign to help spring Chinook and winter steelhead in the Willamette Basin?
Well, maybe I'll start, and others can add in on the more technical side of things. So I think this is one of those places where those earlier reports, those WRDA reports, and quite frankly, maybe also alternatives that should have been included but were not in NEPA analysis, would be incredibly helpful, right? This is why Congress is directing the Army Corps of Engineers to look at what it would take and how it would work under a scenario where we have hydropower deauthorization. That, again, we're missing reports, right, from WRDA 2020, WRDA 2022. These reports should have been able to build on each other so that we can get to higher degrees of certainty and planning to understand the best path forward. And that would enable us to be getting things like, how do you change those rule curves and all those additional levels of detail? Since we aren't getting those reports, we are entirely kind of backed up on the basic information that would be where we really believe we should be in terms of charting that path forward and understanding things like how additional or new rule curves would work. So I think this is where you're seeing a lot of frustration from folks on the continual stalling and the just missing. We don't know where it is. We submitted it to headquarters. We can't say when our overdue reports will be released. And so that's why this is really creating such a problem. But Jennifer and Laurie may want to say more about what we need to move forward in these without hydropower.
Go ahead, Jennifer. You're on the congressional front.
Well, I think Kathleen has mentioned it now a few times. It's like, we need this information in order to make congressional decisions around the authorization of hydropower. And that is something that the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and a coalition of various conservation groups have been focused on, is that deauthorization pathway and making those decisions, because it will take a congressional nexus to get there.
It looks like we have time for one more question, and it goes to kind of the advocacy side of things. What if we don't live in Oregon? How can we help support this cause?
Well, that's a great question. I'll kick it off. I think Laurie or Kathleen mentioned that this year the Army Corps will be doing a supplemental environmental impact statement. We expect that to, at least in draft form, come out, well, they're saying late summer, early fall, but I've heard timelines like that before and then haven't seen things for years. So we will let you know when it comes out, and provide opportunities for folks to provide comments in support of actions that can help fish. And I think also just talking to your own congressionals, while this is an Oregon issue, it's also an everyone issue. There's no reason that people in other places cannot support what needs to happen here, because this is important for our communities and for the larger function of our world.
You know, Jennifer's absolutely right. And this is one of those very unique times we're doing the right thing for salmon, and steelhead is also doing the right thing for electricity ratepayers throughout the West. So you may not live in Oregon, but if you are paying for electricity throughout the entire Bonneville Power Service area, doing the right thing and not requiring all of us who are paying those rates that are higher than they should be for that tiny amount of hydropower that is being produced at enormous expense. I know I'm sick of it. You're probably sick of it. So if you would like more reasonable power rates, we can get rid of this ridiculously expensive hydropower and have a more efficient and rational hydropower policy throughout the West. So you can also speak up as a ratepayer and say, I'm sick of paying for more expensive power than I need to. Let's get rid of hydropower where it does not make sense. And that's at Willamette System dams.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Laurie, for your insights today. And thank you to our attendees for your thoughtful questions and for joining us to view this important webinar. I will say this important work that's being done by the groups who are represented here today, it relies on your support. So if you feel inspired by today's webinar, we hope you will give a gift to help us continue this important work and or take action to save salmon. I will be sending a follow-up email including information about how you can get involved and the recording of today's webinar as well on YouTube. Please feel free to share it with folks who you think might be interested in our work. Stay tuned in the months ahead for information on our next Voices for the West webinar. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thanks, everyone.